Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. Welcome to Everything Co-op. I'm in Washington, D.C., and we have Professor George Parker on. He's at Stanford University. He's the Dean Witter Distinguished Professor of Finance, Emeritus. Good morning, Professor Parker.
Good morning.
So thank you for taking time out. I know it's early out there, 7:30 in California, so I really appreciate your taking the time and getting up early and talking to us this morning. I had you in school teaching finance in about 74. I graduated in 76 with an MBA. And what I recall, a couple things. One was you made finance simple. I could understand it clearly the way you taught, and I really appreciate that. I've been able to use it my whole career. So I want to thank you for teaching and teaching in a way that people could understand it. I understand it, and we were at Stanford's 100th year celebration, the MBA, the program, the business school, I guess a couple Fridays ago, maybe 3 Fridays ago. And I had the pleasure of sitting with you for breakfast. So we had talked a little bit. So I first want to ask you, where did you grow up and go to school?
I was born in a town called Westchester, Pennsylvania, which is about 15 miles west of Philadelphia. My parents were school teachers at a Quaker boarding school outside of Philadelphia called the Westtown Friends School. And I lived there until I finished the 7th grade. That would make me about 12 years old. And then my family uprooted and moved to suburban Los Angeles up there, which was a huge change in culture and geography. I went to the rest of middle school and high school in Los Angeles, in a suburb called Arcadia, California, which is adjacent to Pasadena. And then when I got out of high school, I went back to Philadelphia again for college, to a college called Haverford College, which is a small Quaker college outside Philadelphia, not far from where I was born. I attended Haverford for 4 years, and then I went back to California to Stanford for my MBA after Haverford. So it was back and forth, East Coast, West Coast, East Coast, West Coast. And that takes me through my MBA. My heritage has always been a Quaker heritage, which is a very small religious sect in the United States. At the time of the Revolution in the United States, the Quakers represented about 20% of the population of the United States, but today it's a fraction of 1%. It's not like it once was.
So I have a friend that's a Quaker, and he's taught me a lot about that religion and focus, and it seems to be helping each other. It seems to be, matter of fact, I met him through the co-op world. He was in housing co-ops, and he talked about co-ops, particularly as it relates to the values of being a Quaker. So you got your MBA at Stanford, focused on finance, I take?
Although, as you know, at Stanford, you don't have formal majors. The MBA degree is the MBA degree, and we don't give a degree in finance or a degree in marketing or a degree in accounting. But within the MBA, people do specialize somewhat. It's basically a general management degree.
Yeah, I was sort of finance and marketing where I focused on.
Yeah.
So where did you go from your MBA?
Well, at the end of the MBA program, there was a draft in the United States at that time. Many students did not choose to want to go in the military because they were not sympathetic with the Vietnam War and with some of the U.S. foreign policy with regard to Asia. And so, interestingly enough, 12 members of my MBA class, which was a class of 210 students, 12 members of that class went in the Peace Corps. And I was one of those people who went in the Peace Corps. I was married at the time. My wife and I both went, and we went to the country of Peru. We were originally scheduled to go to Ethiopia, but at the 11th hour and the 59th minute, the Peace Corps said, no, we need you more in Peru than Ethiopia. So we went to Peru. And when I got to Peru, I was assigned to an organization in Peru that promoted and oversaw about 250 credit unions. And as you know, credit unions are one part of the co-op movement, one of the oldest parts of the co-op movement, actually. I learned a lot about co-ops and credit unions through the Peace Corps activity in Lima, Peru, and then subsequently in a small town in the High Sierra in Peru, where I managed a credit union for about a year and a half. And then I came back to Stanford. Well, first I came back to California, and I became a commercial banker for about a year and a half in a small community bank that was owned by my cousin in Bakersfield, California.
Okay.
And after being in the bank for about a year and a half, I started to teach part-time at the local junior college. And I liked the teaching better than the banking. So I called up Stanford and managed to talk my way into the PhD program at Stanford. And I entered the PhD program in 1965. Because I already had an MBA, I was able to finish my PhD in 2 years. And then I went to New York City, back to the East Coast again, in this East Coast, West Coast rhythm that I'd established, and we lived for 6 years in New York City, teaching at Columbia University at the business school there. And then the phone rang with an opportunity to come back to Stanford, and so I came back from New York to the West Coast in 1973. And I've been here ever since, 52 years later.
Wow. So we were in New York the same time. I was teaching mathematics out in Jamaica, Queens, at City University.
Oh, yes.
In 1970, I believe, 71. And then I went to teach math at San Diego State for a couple years before I went to the MBA. And I was teaching math in the Afro-American Studies department. And the belief was that in the mathematics department, people believed that blacks and brown folks couldn't learn math, and they didn't. And in the Afro-American Studies department, the sense was if I believed that they could learn mathematics, then they would. And the reward was not money in teaching. I don't know how you've seen it, but it was watching the light get on somebody when they turn on, when they get it, and the excitement in their face and in their eyes when they learn it. And I became the first chair of the Afro-American Studies Department. I did a terrible job of it, Dr. Parker. And that's what caused me to come to Stanford. I had to learn how to manage. Okay.
Well, we were in New York at the same time. That's clear. If you were there in 1970, that's the same time. Yeah.
Okay, so you're back at Stanford. They called you back, and now you're teaching, and you're teaching finance. And as I said, I really enjoyed your class. What was the compensation for you? And I'm not talking money. And like I said, for me, for teaching, the compensation, and I miss it. I try to teach every chance I get, or do a webinar or something, was watching people learn when the light came on. That was the main reward for teaching. What's been your reward for teaching for 57, 58 years now, sometime.
Well, when students are pleased with the learning experience in your class, they tend to be very expressive. They tend to show their delight a great deal, and that's a source of great reward. I might say the flip side of that is that when students are not happy with your teaching, they also make that loud and clear. And that's, I've sometimes, this is a peculiar thing to say, but I don't know whether good teachers are motivated primarily by the reward of approval or the complete fear of failure. As a matter of fact, in life, I don't know what motivates most high-achieving people, whether it's the rewards of success or an abnormal fear of failure. I think both of us would probably agree there are elements of both. When people get out of bed in the morning, it's not because they're enthusiastic about doing something, it's partly because they're scared to death not to get out of bed. What might happen if they didn't get out of bed? As I've gotten older, I have come to believe that motivation comes from both the carrot and the stick. I don't know the proportions of those two things. I don't know whether you'd agree with that or not, but it has occurred to me that that's true.
So I have found for me, it's the carrot motivates me more than the stick. And that's also what I use in my management and most people respond to the carrot. All don't by any stretch. But I've used the carrot as the main motivator when I'm teaching or when I'm leading an organization. So fear has its reward and it can create a lot of stress on somebody.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, there's a microcosm of the real world sometimes in athletics. And when I see a very accomplished athlete, I sometimes wonder what makes that athlete work so hard. I've sometimes asked them, do you work hard because of the adrenaline you get from winning, or do you work so hard because you find losing so very painful? And most of them will say both.
Well, I played football through a couple years of college, high school and college, and when I realized I couldn't go to pro at 5'10", middle linebacker, I let that go and stay with the books. But it was both.
Yeah.
I did not like the taste of defeat. Did not like that at all. And I loved the sweetness of winning.
Of victory, yeah.
Yeah.
So what do they call it? The thrill of victory and the something of defeat. But they're both constants in people's lives. Anyway, but I've gotten tremendous reward out of teaching, and if you're lucky enough to teach at Stanford, the pay is pretty good and certainly enough to live on, and so it's been a very rewarding career for me, and partly to have students like you in class, Vernon, is one of the specific rewards. It's very nice, particularly when they come back 50 years later or almost 50 years later and say, that class was very meaningful to me. That's music to any professor's ears.
Yep. I taught for 12 years, so every now and then somebody will come and say something, and it's music. That's the tremendous reward. And I was in the Vietnam era. I did not want to go. My grandfather was World War I vet. My father was World War II vet. And they sort of set me and my two brothers down and tried to basically say, we don't understand this war, and advised not to go. So I went into teaching in Cleveland in middle school in a Catholic school to get a 1Y deferment to not go. Yeah. And I always felt bad about that because I wanted to serve, until a Vietnam vet said, you probably did more good teaching than we did in Vietnam.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
So let's go. I'm going to go over now to co-ops. You mentioned that you were working with co-ops in Peru, first with the umbrella organization, 125 co-ops, and then you manage a co-op. So I want to quickly talk about the different types of co-ops. I've labeled them into 4 different categories. The first 2 depends on who owns and controls the business. If the business is owned and controlled by the employees, it's called a worker co-op. And to me, this could be any business. Some people say you don't want to have more than 500, but if you go to Mondragon, they have 82 businesses and about 70,000 employees in those 82.
Excuse me, I didn't. What was that? If you're
Mondragon in Spain have about 82 businesses, co-op businesses, and they form a federation, and they have about 70,000 employees, and that's a worker co-op.
Are they engaged in retail or financial services or
all of the above?
Everything.
Yep, they even have a college, a bank.
Okay. And grocery stores?
Yep.
And auto parts manufacturers?
I'm not exactly sure. I know they have a furniture manufacturing. I know they have manufacturing, and they not only have it in Spain, but they are also around the world. They do manufacturing in different places around the world.
Okay.
That's the worker co-op. And then you have consumer co-ops, and you mentioned credit unions. That's a consumer co-op. They are owned and controlled by the people who uses the products or services.
Correct.
That's it. And food co-ops fall in that. Most housing co-ops are, housing co-ops are consumers. Food co-op could be a consumer co-op or a worker co-op. There's a health clinic in Madison, Wisconsin, that's a consumer co-op owned by the patients. And then the next 2 is when groups of people or businesses come together and create a business. If they create a business to buy the products and services they need in their manufacturing, in their work, then it's called a purchasing co-op. Farmers use this a lot. Department of Agriculture knows more about co-ops than any other organization, any other division of the federal government. Artists are using it now. There's a group called Consumer Purchasing Alliance in D.C. that purchase for charter schools and churches and all kinds of different products. And the 4th one is if a group of people or businesses come together to create a business that markets their products or services. It's called a marketing co-op. If they add value, okay, then it's called a producer co-op, marketing/producer co-op. The Cabot Creamery is an example of that. Land O'Lakes, Ocean Spray, and then there's an artist group in Pittsburgh called Ujamaa that they've formed together to market their necklaces and jewelry and paintings and clothing. And they have a storefront and they have an online presence and they market the products. So these are the 4 types that I've known and categorized them, and you have talked about credit unions in your experience with credit unions. But at the table, we also talked about food co-ops. And so can you talk about, before food co-ops, in the capitalistic model, you were saying it works. Can you tell me why it works? Me and the audience, why does capitalism work?
Well, in Northern California, there was a chain of food co-ops. And they were referred to by the customers typically as just the co-op, but there might have been a descriptor before, like the Palo Alto Food Co-op or something. But anyways, food co-op. And they had a big store, 30,000 square feet in Palo Alto, and another big store in Berkeley, another one, I think, across the bay in Hayward, Fremont. I think altogether they had 5 or 7 stores. And as you know, a business tends to call itself a business. Co-ops sometimes call themselves a movement, the co-op movement, meaning that it's more than just a business. It's an endeavor. It's a it's a aggregation of people that are putting forth effort for a purpose that is somewhat other than business. The co-op here was very successful until at some point it was not successful. Like so many things in life, it was a matter of degree. It was not a matter of black and white. It was or on and off. It was a matter of degree. The co-op movement started to be successful because it was such a nice idea that we're going to bring together a bunch of people who are going to work for something called a co-op, and they're going to deliver or provide groceries to the community, presumably at a slightly better price than the capitalist grocery stores, because they don't have to earn a profit for the absentee owners, and they should have a cost structure by virtue of not having that profit, which is better than the capitalist grocery stores. And they're going to treat their employees fairly, and they're going to provide high quality food and so forth. And that co-op movement, and they're going to, in a sense, to the extent that there are profits, they're going to rebate the profits to the consumers, to the customers themselves, on the basis of how much they spent over the last year. So if you spent $2,000 at the co-op and they decide that they made an extra amount of money on their business over the year, they might give you a 3% rebate in cash. And instead of that money going to some absentee owner, like stockholders in Safeway, that whatever profits there were would be rebated to the people who were customers. Mm-hmm. And you might say on the surface of that, how great is that? I mean, that is a dream. That is about the most wonderful notion you've ever thought, that if somehow people were making money off this endeavor, the people who ought to be entitled to it are the customers. And you pay a living wage to the employees, maybe better than a living wage, a slightly generous wage. And that all worked very well. But as I said before, it worked very well until it didn't. And what happened over a period of about, it was a relatively long period. I think the big grocery co-op in Palo Alto was in business for almost 30 years. But over time, all of a sudden, the co-op grocery store had too many employees. And it began to have about almost 50% more employees per dollar of sales than Safeway did. And because it had more employees, it wound up having higher prices than Safeway. And some people might say, well, that's okay if you have higher prices, because the co-op is doing a noble thing, it's a noble endeavor, an idealistic undertaking. It's not really meant to have the lowest prices. It's just meant to be an inspiring organization. And the public bought that for the longest period of time until the price discrepancy between the co-op and Safeway got too large, and then people started to throw idealism out the window. Say, we're going to go to Safeway, we're not going to. Co-op was in a position of losing sales, but because the co-op had a very Kum Ba Yah, and you heard me talk about that before, had a very Kum Ba Yah spirit and Kum Ba Yah vibe, when it came time to lay off some people, the co-op found it very hard to do that, because the people who they were laying off were the same people who elected the executives who had to make the layoff decisions.
Professor Parker, we have to take a break.
Yeah.
And so I want you to remember we're talking about Kum Ba Yah and that made that big co-op, food co-op in Northern California. So we can take this back up right after the break. And so everybody out there, we will take a break. Please don't touch that dial. Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oaks, and we have Dr. George Parker from the Stanford Business School on with us today. He teaches finance, and I said earlier, he taught me, and an excellent professor. I really appreciated the time we were together in class because he took major subjects and made them simple and understandable. And whenever I taught after that, Professor Parker, I try to use you as a model of what I wanted to do when I taught marketing at Howard University for 5 years. So we were talking about, well, first off, we've been on air 12 years. We're in our first month of our 13th year. We were only going to do the show for 1 month, the month of October, which is co-op month. The National Cooperative Bank, a gentleman that was the president, Chuck Snyder, he's no longer with us, but he heard the show, liked the show, and they've been our main financial sponsor for these 12 years. NCB's mission is to support co-ops and their members, especially in low-income communities, by providing innovative financial services. And that's a bank, Professor Parker, that was created in the middle 80s by the government so that co-ops could have financing. And it is a co-op itself. The people that deposit with them and get loans from them are their members. But we were talking about a food co-op in Northern California that went under. Right before the break, you were talking about how prices kept going up, mainly because of high employment costs.
Yeah, inefficiency, which was primarily driven by labor.
Yeah.
And that somehow the co-op was not able to make the hard decisions that it needed to make, which was to reduce labor costs. Partly since the labor in the co-op, I think, perhaps felt so entitled. Perhaps the labor was, well, I guess the best way to say it is that there didn't seem to be anybody that could run the co-op as a tight ship as much as needed to be done for the co-op to be competitive. Now, the public is willing to pay more money to shop at a co-op, but they're not willing to pay unlimited amounts of more money. Kind of a threshold, and it's not defined. People vote with their feet. They don't always explain why they're doing what they're doing, but when people came around and said, why are you no longer shopping at the co-op? People would say, because the prices are too high. And so I think it's a perpetual challenge in a co-op of any sort to have the discipline, some people would call it the hard-nosed discipline, to be efficient. And efficiency can sometimes be a little bit harsh. And yet efficiency is very important. It's important to survive in a competitive world. It's important to give people maximum value in a societal sense. And so the challenge is in a co-op to find who has the incentives, who has the motivation to be the front lines in terms of promoting efficiency and productivity and not just Kum Ba Yah, feel good. Now, in a profit-making business, the feel-good component comes from making a profit. But a co-op doesn't make a profit that anybody's entitled to. So where do you get the feel-good motivation that comes from the profit motive in a capitalistic business, and find that in a co-op business to have the co-op produce the same results? And I like to say, I think the co-op business is one of the most wonderful, idealistic, hopeful, humanitarian ideas on the planet. But it always faces the challenge about whether or not it can provide the incentives for people to run a truly tight ship, which also has societal benefits in terms of lower costs, lower prices, innovation, efficiency, all those other positive things that make businesses succeed. And I hope that I always root for the co-op to thrive. But in the credit union world, for example, which was my Peace Corps experience, when I was a young man in my 20s and working in the credit unions, and I thought, credit unions ought to rule the credit world.
Yep.
They ought to put banks out of business.
Yep.
It's just so obvious. Why wouldn't they put banks out of business? There's no profit that they have to give to absentee shareholders, and there's so much nicer places to work. And yet, over the next 20 or 30 years, I happen to notice, as you've noticed, as I know as well, that credit unions have not put banks out of business, that banks have continued to thrive and grow, and if anything, the credit union market share has sort of stalled at about 5 or 6 or 7% of the world. And I ask myself all the time, why don't credit unions just keep growing and growing and growing until sooner or later there are no more banks, they're just credit unions? And my explanation for that is sometimes credit unions are not as efficient.
Credit unions provide training for their consumer co-op, so they're owned by the people that make deposits into them and have checking accounts.
That's right.
And then they provide products like car loans, home loans, at normally a lower rate because they don't have that profit motivation. And therefore, it seemed like they would flourish and capture more market share. And you say the reason is they're not as efficient.
Yeah, I think in many cases they do not provide lower rates. And in some cases, they may have higher loan losses than some banks. I don't have all the statistics at my fingertips, but I know at Stanford we have a credit union, and I used to be a member. I'm not a member right now. It's interesting that they use the terminology member instead of customer. One of the reasons was that I like to do a lot of my banking on Saturday, and the credit union wasn't open on Saturday. And I went to Wells Fargo Bank, and they were open on Saturday. And I said to the credit union, because I used to talk to their board of directors, why don't you open on Saturday? And they said, the employees don't want to open on Saturday. They don't want to work on Saturday. And I thought, oops, who's going to tell the people they have to work on Saturday if they're going to compete?
Mm-hmm.
And they said, well, people don't come here because we're open on Saturday. They come here because they believe in the credit union, because they're part of the movement. And I thought, boy, that's an idealistic thought, but that only will go so far. That'll go part way, but it won't go the whole way to capturing market share.
Well, I belong to the NIH Federal Credit Union, National Institute of Health. They were the credit union when I taught at George Washington. I taught marketing there. So I joined them 30 years ago or something.
Yeah.
And they open on Saturday mornings.
They did.
They do, yeah. They're open on Saturday.
Good for them.
Don't have as many branches as I would like, and
Yeah.
okay, but
Are you still a customer of the credit union?
yes,
Yes.
Yeah.
Good for you.
yeah.
So that's what it takes. Yeah.
I would like to get the numbers on the rates. Many cases, the rates are not lower. In many cases, they have more loan faults. No, people don't pay their loan.
Now, do you have a credit union credit card?
Yes,
Good.
I have a debit card at the credit union.
Yeah. And a credit card?
No, I don't have the credit card. I did look at that. They gave so much. Every time you used it, for every dollar, you got 2 cents or something like that. They got
Yeah.
some thing, but I never got that. My credit card is with Southwest, so I get points for traveling. And so I like that.
Okay, Southwest Airlines, yeah. But there's an example of that credit card with Southwest actually has a bank connected with it. I don't
Chase.
Chase Bank. I don't know why. The biggest credit union in America is really quite a large credit union. It's $25 or $30 billion now, I think. And it's the Navy Federal Credit Union. And if you want to learn about credit unions, you should go. And it's headquartered in suburban Washington. I ran for about 15 years, I ran a credit union executive program at the Stanford Business School.
Oh, okay.
And the Navy Credit Union sent us executives every year to that program. And it's probably the most successful credit union anywhere, partly because it services the armed forces, and that's such a large affinity group.
I want to get their motto in. It says, "Our members are our mission."
Yes.
So that fits in with the armed services of a mission, but it is the members, and that's the people that have the banking accounts there and the credit card accounts.
Right. The Armed Forces has done that. Armed Forces has a huge mutual casualty insurance company, too, called, USAA?
Yes.
United States Annuity Association or something, but USAA is a co-op of sorts, and it's very successful. So the co-op movement does compete, but it doesn't outcompete the for-profit banks and insurance companies in every case. And the question is why? And the answer is often efficiency. And so I'm circling back to something I said before. I think the challenge in running a credit union is to hold yourself to the same standards that the for-profit businesses hold themselves to in pursuit of profit. And when you don't have profit to be an objective, how do you make the hard decisions that relate to efficiency and cost? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that's the right question.
Okay. We mentioned credit unions. I want to go now to talk about the future. So we have Trump in the White House with his people, and they seem to really embrace capitalism, and I would say the ugly side of capitalism. They're wanting to extract, and not put things back in the economy for the masses of people. And then we just had Mondawi in New York that won as a mayor, and he run on political socialism. Where would you see us going in the U.S. with those two totally different views on the economy and how to help the masses of people or the oligarchs?
I remember there was a professor at Stanford, you may or may not have known him, named Ezra Solomon. He was a professor of economics at the business school. And he said something, I think the quotation is not. Professor Solomon said one time, "George, always remember forecasting is very difficult, especially about the future." I thought, what a funny thing to say. But he said, it's very easy to forecast the past, but forecasting the future is always questionable. And we both understand what he means. Nobody knows exactly where the United States is headed. Mondami is clearly talking about the failures of capitalism in terms of the people left behind, in terms of the people who feel like the system is rigged against them. All the unhappy folks who have watched capitalism function and have lost faith. And that gives rise to the extreme progressive movement, which is Mondami. The flip side of that is that in many places where democratic socialism has been in place, the economies have not thrived as much. For example, in Sweden, 20 or 30 years ago, democratic socialism was really the dominant theme of their economy, and Sweden's economy began to sputter. And in the last 10 years, Sweden's economy has gone back in a very strong way back towards capitalism. The same thing's been true in the Netherlands and to some extent in the UK. So it strikes me that society tends to lurch forward, going right at certain points, and produces tremendous incentives, but produces a lot of people who are left behind. And then when there are too many people who are left behind, the society turns to the left and tries to incorporate a lot of those people and gets rid of a lot of the incentives that have produced the inequity that capitalism often produces, and the democratic socialism gets in place. And then the democratic socialism sometimes winds up producing inefficiency and an economy that's not growing, and people say we need to provide more incentive, and so it goes right again. I've sometimes thought steering between capitalism and democratic socialism is kind of like driving a car down the road, and on the side of the road are two big ditches, and one is capitalism and the other ditch is socialism. And if you go into the ditch on either side of the road, so successful democracies are trying to steer the car down the road without going in the ditch on either side. And I think New York City went in the capitalism ditch, and Mandami is bringing it back to a democratic socialism point of view, and that may produce another ditch on the side of the road. And that back and forth, yin and yang, left and right, is a tension in society that's never going to be completely resolved. Just like when you drive a car, you're always moving the steering wheel. You don't just set it and forget it. You're steering left, steering right, steering left, steering right. And that's become my philosophy a little bit. And I like to see co-ops exist side by side with for-profit businesses and watch them both duke it out for success, and allow the competition between the co-op model and the for-profit model to exist. And I think it makes the co-op model better, and it makes the for-profit model better for both of them to exist side by side. And I think for the last 50 or 100 years in the United States, that's what we've had. And I hope that's what we continue to have. And I hope the co-ops thrive. But the co-ops need to understand that in order to thrive, they have to be hard-nosed a little bit. They have to be focused on some of the most demanding parts of business, which are efficiency and productivity and relevance, and not just on Kum Ba Yah. Although they don't want to lose the Kum Ba Yah, because Kum Ba Yah is part of the movement, and that's part of what they are, but it's not entirely what they are. And the for-profit businesses have to realize that if they become greedy and utterly disdainful of the interests of their workers and the public, they're going to fail, because the public is demanding something more than just profit. And that, that's not as simple as some people would like the world to be, but I think it's realistic. What do you think?
So I'm really liking this conversation, because what I remember in your class and future classes, once we learned finance, we used that in other classes. And we took your finance class either the first or second semester. It was early on in the education. Was that decisions were made on what gives you the greatest return on investment. So the ROI was the piece that was focused on to make decisions. And it's like, well, how can you have ROI as one focus point, but what's the impact on climate change or on the environment as some other focal points in measurable kinds of ways? But what are the other kinds of things that you can look at that would cause one to make a better decision? And so that's what I think. I'm against capitalism from purely greed and extraction. I'm for co-ops in Kum Ba Yah, working together, supporting each other. The values, the ethical values of honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others. That caring for others is huge for me. And I didn't see that so much in the capitalistic world. I worked in it for 30 years. I didn't see that business I owned when I worked for a Fortune 500 company. So yeah, I think there's a place for, I like this conversation. There's a place for both, and how can each of them learn from the other?
And they make each other better for both to exist. When capitalism becomes too extreme and too dysfunctional, the co-op movement is a place for people to turn. But when the co-op movement becomes too comfortable and too
inefficient,
too inefficient, and maybe a little bit too smug and righteous, it needs to realize that there are certain demands of a free market economy that need to be addressed in order to thrive. And those demands of a free market economy are efficiency and low cost. And innovation is something that we generally consider to be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly I do.
Mm-hmm.
However, you have to recognize that virtually all innovation has a dark side. You know, innovation makes certain tasks no longer relevant, makes certain tasks no longer meaningful and useful. And you say, well, what are you going to do with the people who've devoted those lives to those tasks that innovation has displaced? And my answer to that is you have to have a system which has a very big safety net, a very generous safety net, to allow innovation to happen without ruining people. And that's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the challenge of society, and that's the challenge of government. And I think it's a challenge we have not met very well recently in the United States. And that's where the challenge going forward, we need to do it, and the co-op movement can be a big part of that.
AI is a perfect example of that, but we only have about 30 seconds. So what message would you like to leave people with?
Well, my message would be, of course, as you know, Vernon, I am a hopeless optimist. I tend to believe that there are so many smart people, and they will find a way forward. I think AI is going to lift society to newer and greater heights. I don't know exactly how that's going to unfold, but I definitely believe that it will. I think it can be a force for good. We allow it to be, but we have to regulate it.
So we've got to go. So everybody out there, we'll see you next Thursday. Please live cooperatively.